they allow their associates to continue to have their own professional liability insurance. They kind of have this thought process of, well, they have their own insurance in case anything happens to them. Okay, but you own the practice, they're working within your practice, and you need to be able to make sure that if something were to happen within your practice, how is that going to be handled from a liability standpoint? If there is an associate that gets named in a lawsuit, is that if that patient has somewhat of a decent attorney, they're going to go after the main corporation that's there. And we want to make sure that the main corporation has liability coverage to be able to protect itself for those risks.
I am so excited for today's episode. This is going to be a great one. Before we get there, though, you guys know we start every podcast out with the Ask Ken segment. And here's the question that came in. And I love this question. And I know I say that about every question that comes in because you guys ask phenomenal questions. But this one is near and dear to my heart. The question from the listener is, should I hire an in-house CFO or should I use a fractional one? I could write a thesis on this. I started as a fractional CFO back in the early 2000s, just like working with all kinds of companies. And then I got pulled into dental and I've been here ever since. But the interesting thing about this is if you get one too early, they're sitting around bored. If you get one too late, you probably don't have near as much cash in the bank as you could have. And there's a lot of infrastructure that you probably are missing out on. And so here's how I would frame this. Most DSOs are going to hire a CFO and they're going to do it too early. And it usually means that maybe it's an accountant, but not somebody that's really financially strategic in how they think about the world. The challenge is if you want to go get a full-time CFO that's very strategic, you're talking $250,000 to maybe $300,000 a year in salary. And so your DSO needs to grow so that it can actually afford that. But that's usually north of 10, north of sometimes 20 locations before that hire is possible. That's where you want to be growing enough that you definitely need some financial advice, but not so far that you're basically paying somebody way more than they should be paid to do the job on a fractional basis. So with all of that being said, the real question is, what outcomes are they going to be responsible for? As you define those, then what happens is there's a fractional CFO. You do not want this person to just show up to meetings. You want them to be hands-on. You want them to be coaching and training other team members based on, whatever the needs are inside the organization. Okay, that is it for fractional CFO talk. Now, super excited to introduce Herb Ford, our guest for today. Herb, I want to turn it over to you to just give a brief introduction, and then we're going to dive right into the Dental Truth Project.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate it. So I'm Herb Ford. I work with Risk Strategies Dental Practice, which is a Brown & Brown company. We specialize in helping practices of all sizes, specifically, emerging groups and DSOs, with all types of insurance. And that is insurance to help protect the company itself. So I'm sure we're going to be talking about that later on today. A little bit about me. I actually started in the business when I was in high school. I started helping out dentists and working within the dental insurance space because my parents owned an insurance agency. So I was the summer labor. So I was working there for several years. After undergrad, I took a couple of years and worked at Merrill Lynch as a financial advisor. And then about 6 years ago, came back to start working with my parents again. And since then, we've gone through a couple of name changes. So that's why we're Strategies Dental Practice now. Been a part of the industry for quite a long time. Been starting to go to a lot of different events as well. So if anybody's traveling, then they'll most likely see me at some of those events, either walking around or we'll have a booth.
Awesome. Yep. I've seen you at just about every event I've been to, I think, over the last year and a half or so. So no, it's awesome to have you on. So this is the Dental Truth Project. This is the opportunity to uncover what's happening in the industry that shouldn't be, or what are the things out there that you're seeing that you think need to be brought to light so that our listeners can run better dental groups and dental practices?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think that needs to be brought to light, especially on this podcast, is that I think there's a certain breaking point with practices, when they've gone, they have several locations and they're growing, they're getting into the emerging group, or the group, they're a DSO now. And the owners or the people that are, commanding the ship need to start taking control of what risk they have. And I don't think that's being talked about enough because, if you go to conferences, if you're listening to people, a lot of it is based on how do you continue to grow and how do you keep everybody happy? Those are incredibly valid points. I think that's really important to make people happy, whether it's their patients, their doctors, that are there, the staff. But I think it's really important also that you protect what it is that you're growing. And nobody's really talking too much about how to be able to protect what it is that they're growing. And that's kind of what I wanted to be able to bring some light to.
Yeah. So Herb, could you maybe give us some examples where you see emerging DSOs or groups or even single, doctors where you see there's liability that they're not thinking about and that they're not properly thinking about how to reduce the risk associated with it?
Sure. So I think the first step is typically when it comes to professional liability insurance for those involved, it's commonly referred to as being malpractice insurance, but the actual name for it is professional liability. And one of the things that we see often is that a lot of the owners of multi-location groups that have multiple associates working at their offices, that they allow their associates to continue to have their own professional liability insurance. They kind of have this thought process of, well, they have their own insurance in case anything happens to them. Okay, but you own the practice, they're working within your practice, and you need to be able to make sure that if something were to happen within your practice, how is that going to be handled from a liability standpoint? Most of the time, if your associate has your own professional liability insurance, has their own professional liability insurance, that's not going to protect the company. And what we see most of the time in a professional liability situation, if there is, an associate that gets named in a lawsuit, is that if that patient has somewhat of a decent attorney, they're going to go after the main corporation that's there. And we want to make sure that the main corporation has liability coverage to be able to protect itself for those risks. So one of the things that we recommend people to have is what's called a group professional liability insurance policy. So it's really easy to set up for the most part. And what's easy about it is that you're able to have all of the doctors that work at your locations on the policy, and all of your practice entities are included and have coverage as well. And that's usually the big thing, is that you want to make sure that you're in control of the professional liability of the people that are working at your practice. And this is kind of where that, not many people are talking about this subject because they're still thinking, oh, well, I'm going to let my associate take control of their coverage. Well, the thing is when you allow them to be in control of of their own professional liability insurance, you're now allowing them also to be in control of who's protecting your practice. Because if something were to happen, and let's say that individual doctor, they accidentally canceled their policy, or their credit card changed and they forgot to update it on their policy. Yep. We see it all the time. And, then that person doesn't have professional liability insurance, but they're working at your practice. You need to make sure that your company has professional liability to be able to cover any situations like that. So we recommend that, for group practices or multi-location with multiple associates of any size, that you have a group professional liability policy in place to make sure that you are in control of what's going on. And now, what that means for the practice is that you're going to get a bill for everything. Now, it is up to you to decide if you want to be able to, treat it as a benefit and pay for that for your associates, or if you don't want to, that's up to you. But the nice thing, at least, is that when you have a group professional liability policy, everybody's getting a discount because you kind of get a group rate. And because of that, it usually makes it less expensive for the associate if you end up passing on the cost to them, or if you decide to take this on as a benefit to yourself, it's still less than if you were paying for everybody's policies, or vice versa,
Yeah, and there is the opportunity there too, where if you're worried about, well, what happens when I leave my employer and now my professional liability is with them, there's tail coverage, which then allows you to keep a consistent set of liability reduction, right? So yeah, tell us about that real quick, Herb. I don't know that everybody understands how the tail coverage works.
Yeah, absolutely. So the tail coverage works with with claims made type policies, and a lot of group practices they have a group professional liability policy. It is oftentimes a claims made policy, and
Mhm.
that's because it is a it's a cost effective policy that allows people to be able to easily come on and come off the group. When somebody leaves that group, then they have like basically the insurance company then offers that associate the ability to purchase professional liability coverage. And that's if that associate is named in a future lawsuit or anything situation. But because the group professional liability policy is still active, the group is still covered even after that person leaves. But if that person were to have their own claims made policy, they leave and then they don't purchase tail coverage, well, then there's no coverage for anybody. Tail coverage itself is basically an add on to a policy after that policy ends, because what it does is that the claims made policy works is that you have coverage in place as long as the policy is active. And then basically, as soon as the policy cancels or is no longer active, then coverage ends. So that add-on or the tail coverage, that is what allows you to say, okay, hey, you know what? You've left, technically coverage has ended, but now because you can purchase this add-on, now it's like you've had coverage the entire time.
Yeah.
So the nice thing with having the group professional liability policy as a claims made policy is that the group is always going to have coverage for their associates if anything happens to them and they get named in a lawsuit. But then if the associate leaves, it's up to them to make sure that they purchase the tail if they personally get named in a lawsuit.
Yeah.
So
And
we recommend that everybody does.
yeah. And the DSO also needs to make sure that they're insuring the entire group and also all of the assets inside of the practice and everything else. And we can get to that maybe a little bit later. Dallin, go ahead.
I'm fascinated by this whole topic of conversation, and especially the larger subject of it's very, very easy to focus on revenue driving initiatives in your business, but it's not very sexy to think about risk. No one wants to be the guy that brings that up in the board meeting because it's an expense. You have to spend money on it. You have to think about risk. You have to mitigate risk, but it doesn't do anything for either your top line or your bottom line, except as protection, right? It's like something could happen. If there is a problem, then it's going to protect us. But right now, it doesn't do anything for us. I come from a cybersecurity background, and we deal with this all of the time. We're trying to sell protection against a future problem that may or may not happen, but really most people see it as an expense that isn't going to do anything for their top line right now. So I would be very interested to hear, you having been in this business for a while, how you navigate that. How do you talk to dental groups or DSOs about being aware of and mitigating risk proactively?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And what it comes down to is sometimes just who the person is that I'm talking to and what experiences they have had will drastically change the responses that I get. Right. So if I'm working for somebody working with somebody who's part of a group practice and maybe they've worked at several others and they've just been around the business, they know that cyber insurance is incredibly important, especially in this day and age. Right. To your point about being involved in cybersecurity, because it is. I think it's something that every practice has to have. And so that's what we tell people. So for those who are aware of it, it's usually not a big conversation. We usually get people who are like, hey, we know we need this. We don't have it. We want to make sure it's taken care of. Or for the situations where they're like, hey, you know what? I think this is an expense. As you mentioned, like it's a future thing. Also, why me? I am a small dental practice, or like I have a couple locations. Nobody wants to attack me. It's like, well, you're actually a great target. Realistically, I've listened to Gary Solomon talk a lot with Black Talon. He will provide all that data if you're really interested in, something like that. But talking to people about why cyber insurance is needed specifically, or just with other insurance, is kind of about talking about, hey, what's the plan if you don't have this? You're right. It's not a sexy thing to talk about. It's not going to be able to, necessarily improve the bottom line right away. But if you have a situation that happens and you're going to have to pull out a serious amount of reserve cash to be able to pay for it, that's going to be an issue on your bottom line, realistically, right? Besides cyber situation, well, if we want to talk about cyber, there are practices that close because they have data breaches,
Yep.
and that's the end of it. Something that I'll pull from is have you guys ever looked at the like Becker's dental stuff online? They have like a great website. They have a lot of different stuff. So
Yeah.
I constantly check their website. They post when people have data breaches all the
Yep.
time. I'm like, I can literally just be like, hey, here's 5 articles from Becker's in the last 2 months of small dental practices, maybe just a couple locations. It's not the Aspens of the world, right? It's people who have 3 to 10 locations who they still have thousands of patient data, and that's what's being attacked. So I help provide that information to them, try to just, also just talk about, hey, what's your plan if you don't have this? Do you have a plan in place? Do you or do you not? And that's usually just kind of getting the gears going where, we're having people just consider and think about what it is that they're going to have to do if they run into this situation. Similar kind of conversation, not with cyber, but it was with employment practices liability insurance. This is EPLI, and it's the type of insurance that protects companies if there's lawsuits about wrongful termination, sexual harassment, discrimination, wrongful term, or I think I said wrongful termination, but basically those many different things related to the personal side with employees. Well, if you're a group and you're now big enough to be able to host an event for your staff, like a Christmas party, or like you're going to go on a retreat and everyone's going to get together, you should have an APLI policy, because realistically, it is not a sexy thing to talk about, but we've seen it where people drink. Sometimes people drink too much. Sometimes people say things that they wish they didn't say the next day. And those situations can be, can cause havoc on a practice. Same thing with like directors and officers liability insurance. If you've got a lot of partners that are, if you have a DSO or a DPO structure where every practice, every doctor is going to become like a practice owner and they're a partner of the company, and then suddenly, maybe the returns that you were expecting are not going to be what they thought they were going to be, and your partners get upset about that, then that company could get sued as well. And so these aren't they're just different things of making sure of like, hey, what's the plan in place? Do you have good contracts in place? Are you having good communication with people? And that's kind of like the process of wanting to talk with people and have them understand that, yes, this is to protect in case something does happen, but it's going to help out so much more if you have it and then something does happen than if anything does happen and you don't have it.
Yeah. I'll mention, just having been in the CFO seat of a couple of, very large DSOs and having, been around a lot of this coverage and it falling under, my team's sort of purview to make sure that things were being done correctly and those sorts of things. It's actually pretty impressive how little you have to pay for coverage that can absolutely make a massive difference. Like an EPLI policy, some of these types of things, those claims, that might be a 50, 75, maybe a dollar type of a claim, depending on, what's going on. And that might not feel so material, but over time, I just found that it was the insurance that we paid for. It was peace of mind and was making sure that we were going to have continuity with our business, even if something really crazy happened, so that we could continue to build and grow what we're doing and not erode or see an erosion of all the value that we've spent so much time and effort to create.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point, Ken. And one of the things that we've seen in the past, 4 or 5 years, because of all the growth that so many DSOs and groups have had, is that, the insurance piece has fallen to the wayside because they're, in the board meeting when everyone's sitting together, like, hey, how can we continue to grow? Or this practice isn't doing as well as we want it to do. How can we, what do we need to do to be able to get it to, on stage or, hit the KPIs that we want it to hit? And we've looked at several current or potential clients where the insurance is just kind of all over the place. They have policies with different brokers. They've got multiple policies for multiple locations. And, if I ask them, it's like, hey, can you provide me the insurance documents that you currently have for everything? Not everybody is in a situation where they can just be like, yeah, hey, here's the file, here's all the documents for you. Everything is, all the ducks are in a row. We typically find that it's not that way. When we do find somebody who like a group that has the insurance covered like that, or they have a group professional liability policy already in place, we're like, hey, congratulations, you guys are already ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
So and that's awesome. And so, it's one of those things right now where people are taking a look at everything, especially now with, some of the growth that they have is kind of slowing down to a certain point, and they're kind of looking at, okay, hey, what is it that we have? What do we need to do? What do we not need to do? What's missing? And that's one of the things that our team's really been able to help out with, is just talking with people, and seeing, just actually helping people understand what it is that they have and what they don't
Mhm.
have.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
other thing for anyone out there that's, listening to this and thinking through where they're at so far in terms of, this type of coverage, I would also strongly advocate that you get involved with a broker that knows dental, because the dental world is different, and the way dental practices need to be covered and the way the associates need to be covered, all of those different things. You really want to make sure you've got somebody that knows all of that. Otherwise, there could be gaping holes in your coverage, or don't we call that Swiss cheese coverage?
Yeah, so it could be Swiss cheese coverage where you've got a number of different policies. You thought one of them had it, multiples don't, and then you find out nothing has it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think from here on out, I'm going to think of this episode as the scared straight episode. The comparison I'll make, I think every teenage boy out there, like somewhere back in their psychology, thinks that they're immortal, thinks that they're invincible. They do dumb stuff all the time just because they don't know any better and they don't know how hurt they can get. And I think that to our conversation, there are many groups that are just juvenile. They haven't been around the block. They don't know how badly they can be hurt. And they're in the mentality that I haven't been hurt yet. And so it's not going to happen. Like nothing bad has happened yet. I'm probably going to be okay. I can keep on flying a little bit longer without taking the steps that I need to protect myself. And I hope that for anyone listening to this podcast episode, the message comes through loud and clear that if you want your business to survive for a long time, you have to start thinking about risk. You have to start thinking about the things that could hurt you in the future and taking steps now to protect yourself.
yeah, I mean, you want to be able to be proactive, right? It's never fun to be reactive, and then you have to figure out, do I have protection for something that's happening? Right now, half the country is getting hit with a huge winter storm, and we want to make sure that, if something happens to those practices, or utility services, affect practices, that they have the right protection in case. A lot of things happened with floods from hurricanes the past year, or I forget, was it 2 years ago when the hurricane hit North Carolina, and that was completely unexpected?
Yep.
There are freak things that happen, and just making sure that you have the right protection is really important. I'm probably a little biased towards that, but I do believe it. That's the truth. And kind of down to your point, where right now, for people that are growing their practice, right, it's very easy to think, well, hey, you know what? This is how I set up the insurance for 1, 2 locations. Why wouldn't I just keep doing that for all of them? Well, it's just not sustainable, and it's also not scalable or efficient. So part of what that, it's just like, your question was almost very similar with the insurance piece earlier today, Ken, where, when should you hire a CFO or have a
Mhm.
fractional CFO? And it's like, hey, it depends on your growth, right?
Yep.
Well, kind of the same point with insurance is like, depending on how you guys are continuing to grow, then you want to make sure that you have something that's scalable for your growth as well, to be able to make sure that, if you're adding locations, or if you have to close any locations, like, it's easy to be able to do that versus having to, jump through a bunch of hoops to make those things happen and protect your businesses.
Awesome. All right, Herb, we're just about out of time. So any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners, as well as feel free to share your contact information if you'd like to.
Yeah, I think the main thing is just start asking yourself the question, hey, what happens if X, Y, or Z were to happen. If I have a data breach tomorrow, do I have insurance coverage? Do my office managers know what to do if that happens? If you have water damage incidents like a pipe bursts, do you know who to contact? Do your office managers know who to contact? And then, kind of from the mess point is like, and then finally, ask yourself the big question is like, am I fully in control of protecting my company? I've put a lot of time into this. I've had a lot of long nights, creating this, this company and everything. And are you making sure that you're protecting it in the same way that you put time in to build it? For contacting me, you can email me at herb.ford@risk strategies strategies.com. My direct work number is 972-663-5195. Free to reach out to me if anybody has questions. That is not my cell phone number, so if you text that number, it will go nowhere. But other than that, those are some of the best ways to get a hold of me.
Perfect. All right, Dallin, any final thoughts?
Nope. Thanks for coming on, Herb. This was a great conversation that I think will be awesome for our listeners.
Exactly.
Awesome. I appreciate it, guys. It meant the world to me to be able to be asked to be here. So I'll see you guys at the next event.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, that's it for today's episode of the Dental Truth Project. Thanks again to Herb Ford for all of the great and amazing insights he brought to us. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We have a new episode that drops every Wednesday morning. I'm Ken Kaufman, and until next time, keep seeking the truth that helps dentistry thrive. Happy day.